Hello Spectator fans, and welcome back to my top 5 favorite video game consoles of all time. My number 3 favorite video game of all time was actually my first video game console, and that's none other than the Sega Genesis, also known as the Sega Mega Drive everywhere outside the United States. In North America, it was released on August 14th, 1989. It sold 41 million units, and Sega actually beat Nintendo to the 16-bit era. Now there was other competition out, but the big two names at the time were Sega and Nintendo. Sega couldn't beat Nintendo in the 8-bit era, so they went ahead and created a new system, which then made Nintendo create their second system, the Super Nintendo. Now I absolutely love the Sega Genesis. It was a top-loading cartridge system, much like the original Sega Mega Drive. It had 2 controller ports, and there were 3 versions of the system. There was the first version that was released. Eventually there was a Genesis Mode 2, which is one that I personally have. And then there was the Genesis 3. There was also even a Sega Genesis on the go called the Sega Nomad. It had batteries, and you could actually put your Sega cartridges into it, but the batteries didn't last very long, so it wasn't very practical. The Sega Genesis was backwards compatible with Sega Master Systems with the addition of the Sega Power-Based Converter. You would put this in your Genesis Model 1 in the cartridge slot, then you would be able to put in your Master System cartridges. The Sega Genesis had 2 add-ons, the Sega CD and the Sega 32X. The Sega CD would attach either underneath the system or on the side, depending which model of the Genesis you had. These obviously played CD-based games. The Sega 32X attached to the top of the system in the cartridge, and these were also cartridge-based games. Both of these add-ons eventually led to the destruction of the Sega Genesis. There's also a separate system called the Sega CD-X, which is the Sega Genesis and CD put together. Now, I absolutely love this system. This is what helped me get into video games. I absolutely love Sonic the Hedgehog. It's my favorite gaming character. He's actually what got me into my career as an artist. I would sit down every day and draw Sonic, collecting rings, defeating Dr. Robotnik. I just absolutely love Sonic, and Sega Genesis for it. They had great games. The Sega Genesis, even though it had a worse sound chip than the Super Nintendo, I still think overall the Sega Genesis has better games than the Super Nintendo. They had great RPGs, wonderful platformers, and weird experimental titles. I remember there was a title called Dinosaurs for Hire, in which you played mutant dinosaurs with guns. That's pretty weird. And one of my favorite games was Battletoads Double Dragons, which was taking 2 series, Battletoads and Double Dragon, and putting them into one co-op game. And it was so cool, and to this day, I still haven't beaten it. Also, Contra Hardcore. That game really got me into Contra, and it's amazing and hard, and I've gotten to the final boss and never beaten it. Just, the Sega Genesis it means so much to me. When I was younger, my system stopped working and we had to throw it out, and I was so sad. But coming to VSU, one of my friends had a spare Sega Genesis, so I bought it from her for $10. Best $10 I ever spent. Now it's time for some Did You Know facts. Did you know that Sega's original mascot was not Sonic the Hedgehog, but instead a character called Alex Kidd? He wasn't popular enough to take over Nintendo, so Sega held a contest within their company to create the new mascot for Sega. Over 200 designs were submitted, but eventually Sonic the Hedgehog and Dr. Robotnik were born. The Sega Genesis was the first console to bundle their best-selling game with the system. The president of Sega of Japan thought this was a terrible idea to bundle Sonic the Hedgehog with the system, but Sega of America president kept pushing for it. Eventually the Sega of Japan president said, "Do what you think is right," and it earned Sega to hold 60% of the home market video game sales in 1992, officially being the first company to ever beat Nintendo. Sega also had motion-based gaming long before the Xbox Kinect or PlayStation Move. The Sega Activator was a track set that you would set up in a circle around yourself. You would be able to put your arms out to move your characters, and even punch or kick to activate controller buttons. It was marketed to help you win at fighting games such as Street Fighter. It didn't work very well. Did you know that Mortal Kombat helped create the ESRB? When this game came out in arcades, it was crazy because it had this realistic violence and blood. When it was ported onto the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, the Super Nintendo version was censored, but the Sega Genesis wasn't, so it had all the blood and gore. Because of this, the ESRB was created to help create ratings for games so that parents would know what kind of game they're getting for their kids. Mortal Kombat 2 was released on both systems, both unaltered. Nintendo learned their lesson. Well, that's all for this time. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope you'll come back for my number 2 favorite system of all time.